Okay, so today I want to talk about prompting. More specifically, how to prompt using a prompt hierarchy. So let me get my pointer out because I'm going to need that. But first we're going to define prompting. So prompting is a strategy that is used to correct learning errors, reduce frustration, and increase independence in a child who is learning a new behavior. The type of prompting needed to produce the desired response depends on the skill that is being taught. So first we got our receptive skills. Those are our nonverbal behaviors. Basically, any behavior that doesn't involve a spoken response. In order to teach that, we're going to teach that using our receptive skills prompt hierarchy. And then we got our expressive skills. Those are our verbal behaviors. Basically, any behavior that requires a spoken response. And we teach this using the expressive skills prompt hierarchy. But first, let's talk about the receptive skills prompt hierarchy. So if you can see here, you always start here down at our most helpful. So this is where you get the most help. And then you, over time, the least amount of help as we go up our pyramid. So you start off with full physical, then you go to partial physical, then you'd use either a model, a gestural, or a positional prompt. Some people say gesture, but other people say gestural. And then it's a visual prompt, and then finally independence. Oh, and one more thing. Independence, that means there's no prompting in place. So basically, you use all this prompting to teach the skill, and then when you take prompting away, what we want to see is them performing that skill independently. All right, so let's talk about the types of receptive prompts. So there's a most invasive to least invasive prompting, which involves starting at the bottom of the pyramid with full physical or hand over hand prompting, then moving that to partial physical prompting, and then moving that to gestural, model, or positional prompt, which you choose depending on the type of skill that's being taught. You don't do all three, you just pick one and use that. And then there's a visual prompt, which is our least invasive prompt. And we use most invasive to least invasive prompting to teach a new nonverbal behavior. So there also, you can arrange it from least invasive to most invasive prompting. So you basically reverse it. Instead of starting with full physical, you start with the least invasive, which is our visual prompting. And then you either pick a gestural, a model, or a positional prompt depending upon the skill. Just one, not all three. And then you go to a partial physical prompt. And then finally, you go to a full physical prompt if necessary. So the difference between most invasive to least invasive is that most invasive is used to teach the nonverbal behavior, and then the least invasive to most invasive is used to correct an error when learning a new nonverbal behavior. So let's pretend you're using a visual prompt to teach this new behavior. So you say, touch the dog, and you show them a visual of the response that they need to do, and that doesn't produce the response. That doesn't produce the response of the child touching the dog like you want. So then to correct the error, you go to wherever you were before. So we were at visual prompt. Then we moved down and increase the invasiveness of the prompt until we get the response that we want, which is touching the dog in this example. So we didn't get them to touch the dog with just the visual prompt. So then we moved to a more invasive prompt with our gestural, and then if we didn't get the response then we'd move to a partial physical prompt, and then if necessary a full physical prompt to help the child perform the correct behavior. So let's look at some examples of these prompts in action. First, let's start with our full physical prompt.
Point to the dog.
Okay, so what happened in the example? The direction, point to the dog, is given by our trainer. The trainer immediately picks up the student's hand and helps the student point to the dog. So they didn't wait. After giving the direction, they just went ahead and prompted them immediately, which is good because especially when you're teaching a new skill, we're going to go ahead and help them from the beginning so that they pick up on what we're asking them to do from the beginning, and that it basically reduces the chance for them to be distracted, um, become enamored with an incorrect response, or associate associate a different behavior with the reinforcement that they receive afterwards. So basically, we give them a lot of support on the front end so that when we fade it out on the back end, they're able to do it independently. So this is the most invasive form of prompting. And we always start here when we're teaching a brand new nonverbal skill. The next thing we do is a partial physical prompt.
Point to the dog.
Okay, so in this example, same thing, the direction point to the dog is given, but this time the trainer doesn't use hand over hand. Instead, they lightly touch the student's forearm and guides the arm and hand towards the correct answer. So they use a less invasive form of physical prompting. They basically just touched the child's hand and started guiding them towards the right answer, and then letting go and allowing the child to finish their response without any physical contact in place. So this is the second most invasive form of prompting. And we move to this level of prompting after full physical prompting produces the correct response for 3 trials in a row. So basically, after you say point to the dog and help full hand over hand, help them touch the dog, and do that 3 times in a row, then you move to our partial physical prompting. So this is our example of gestural prompting. It'll load. Here we go.
Point to the dog.
Okay, so here, let's watch that again just in case it was short. Nope, go back.
Point to the dog.
Okay, so what happened in the example? So again, the direction point to the dog is given. The trainer touches the correct answer and waits for the child to respond. So that's what's different. All you do is touch the right answer that you want them to do and hope that they independent of physical prompting, touch the correct answer. So this is the third most invasive form of prompting. We move to this level of prompting after partial physical prompting produces the correct response, so 3 trials in a row. So basically, on this one, we do this what they saw in the video 3 times in a row, and then if they continue to touch the dog correctly with just physical prompting, that's when we move to the gestural prompting. Okay, after gestural prompting, you have a visual prompt. I know this looks a little different. There wasn't a video demonstrating that, but let's talk about what's happening in this example. So there's a bigger direction. Put the shirts away that was given at the start of the task. So this task has multiple steps. The trainer is pointing to the current step in the task to help the child perform the behavior, pick up the shirts. So, and this is the least invasive form of prompting. So basically all you do is you either show them a picture, or if it's like a picture in like a schedule of like pictures, like in the example here, you just point to the picture or show them the picture of the skill that they need to perform. And you move to this level of prompting again after gestural prompting produces the correct response for 3 trials in a row. So why is this example why is this for an excuse me, why is this example for a different behavior? All right, so not all behaviors require a visual prompt. Um, so for the other example of like touch the dog, if you show a picture of the dog, the kid might actually touch the visual and not the actual response that we're looking for from our field of three on the table. Um, and basically, other types, you can use it to show a picture, a text, or a video example of the correct behavior. So it doesn't have to be a picture, it could be like a written word, so you could just show them the visual that says pick up the shirts if they're a reader, or you could even show them like a short video of someone picking up the shirts for something that, requires some complex movements. And basically, visual prompting is more useful when trying to link multiple behaviors together to complete an entire task. So I like the visual prompting better because when we're talking about multiple behaviors that we're trying to link together, because it could be kind of hard to know which behavior to perform when you're doing multiple steps without our like written and visual instructions to follow along with. All right, so let's talk about the other alternatives to gestural prompting, which is either a model or a positional prompt. So, a model prompt basically involves demonstrating or modeling the actual behavior that needs to be performed. All right, so let's look at a model prompt.
I'm now going to demonstrate a model prompt. Watch me. You do it.
Okay, so in that example, the trainer modeled the behavior and then provided the student with the opportunity to perform the same behavior, in this case, sweeping. So you could use that instead of a gestural prompt, which was the pointing to the correct answer, when it would be appropriate to model something like washing your hands. It would be a good one to model. Um, you know, Demonstrating like putting clothes. If you've got multiple clothes to like put into the washing machine, you could like put one in to model it, and then have the kid do the rest. That'd be a good example of a model prompt. And then the last one is a positional prompt. Basically, that involves placing the correct answer closer than the incorrect answer. So let's watch this example.
Give me the cookies. Great job. Give me the cookies. Good work. Give me the cookies. Nice job. Give me the cookies.
Okay, so if you watch that, they started off with the position of this cookie a lot closer to the student than the toolbox. And she said, give me the cookies. So the student picked up the picture that was closer to them and handed that to the teacher. And as you saw there at the end, the last trial, they put them side by side instead of the right response being closer. So over time, a positional prompt, you would inch that right answer closer and closer in line with the other options. Basically, we're going to use this if a gestural prompt isn't working. You're trying to use a gestural prompt, but the kid isn't touching the right answer. So you move the wrong ones back and you put the right one closer, and then inch them closer and closer and closer, trial by trial, until they're lined up together. And then once they're lined up together, you've officially faded out that positional prompt. So receptive prompt hierarchy in action. Let's take a look at it. So how are we going to teach a new behavior? These are the steps. So we're going to give a verbal or visual direction at the start of each trial. So in the other example, the direction was touch the dog. Then we're going to immediately prompt using the most helpful prompt, which is for receptive behaviors, full physical prompting. Then we're going to fade the intensity or helpfulness of the prompts one level at a time when the child performs the correct behavior for at least 3 trials in a row with the current level of prompting in place. So for those first 3 trials, we're using full physical prompting. After we get the correct response with full physical prompting 3 trials in a row, then we do partial physical prompting. We use partial physical prompting until we get 3 trials in a row with that in place, and then we use a model, gesture, or positional. I prefer gestural for most of them, or model if it's more complex behavior. And then when you get 3 trials in a row with gestural in place, then you do visual. And then you get 3 trials in a row of the correct response with visual in place. And then you take out all your prompting, and then you hope that you get independent responding. So you start here, touch the dog, help them touch it 3 times in a row. Partial physical, touch the dog. Get them started by touching them, but then taking your hand away and letting them touch the dog by themselves. Do that 3 times in a row, and they get the right answer. Then you move to the gestural, which was pointing to the right answer and saying touch the dog, and if they do that 3 times in a row, then you just move to a visual, which could either be a picture of them touching the picture of the dog, or if they're a reader, you could have the words written like touch the dog or touch the picture of the dog, and then they touch the picture of the dog. But after they do that 3 times in a row, then you take out all of our prompting and just say touch the dog. And if they've truly learned what and paid attention, they're gonna not need any prompting. They're just gonna go and touch the dog immediately. And then we're gonna want to get at least 4 out of 5 trials in a row where they're performing the skill independently before we try to teach, a different or related behavior. So this is what it looks like in action. So prompt fading when a child makes no error. This is for our receptive skills. So you do full physical, there's no error. You get another full physical in trial 2, there's no error. Then in trial 3, you get another full physical. All right, so we feel pretty good that they understand how to do the behavior using full physical prompting. So then we're going to fade the intensity of that prompting to partial physical for the next trial. If they keep getting the correct response, we're going to keep using that. So we get partial physical trials 4, 5, and 6, and then if they're still performing the skill correctly after that, then we're going to fade that to gestural prompting for the next trial. And if we get 3 trials in a row where they're performing the correct response, we're going to fade out gestural prompting to visual prompting. Visual prompting until we get 3 trials in a row of visual prompting with the correct response. And then we're going to take out all the prompting. So no prompting after a visual or verbal direction is given. So basically, whatever we say to cue the student to perform the behavior, as long as there's no prompting in place for 4 out of 5 trials, we can assume that the child has learned the new behavior. Okay, now let's talk about what we do when there's an error. So we're doing good. We got our full physical prompting. Our first 3 trials, we fade to partial physical. We get a good response. Trial 5 though, oh no, incorrect response with a partial physical prompt. So what do? We just full physical prompt that correct response for the end of that trial. At the start of our next trial, we just use a full physical prompt at the start of that trial again until we get 3 correct responses in a row with our partial physical prompting. Then after partial physical produces the correct response 3 times in a row, we're gonna fade that down to gestural prompting for trial 9. And then over in trial 10, oops, we didn't get the correct response with just our gestural prompt. So then we're going to move back, we're going to fade back into our more invasive prompting. So we're going to, first we're going to go down to our partial physical. And then if necessary, we're going to use that full physical prompt to get the correct response. Then we're going to try it, then we got to start back over with our 3 in a row. So we got to get gestural prompt, the correct response, 3 times in a row. And then after that, you move to your visual prompt. And if you make a mistake with the visual prompt, then same thing. First you use your gestural prompt, then if necessary, you move to partial physical and then full physical to prompt the correct response if necessary. Then we got to start over trying to get 3 times in a row of them producing the correct response. So they got it right with the visual prompt 3 times in a row. So then we take out prompting and after our verbal direction. So this is where they perform it independently. All right, they did it once. Great job. Oops, they made an error. So this is how we correct that error. So when there's no prompting, basically we just add in our prompts with the least invasive. We use a visual, then if necessary, we use a gestural, then a partial physical, and then a full physical if necessary to prompt the correct response. And basically, when you start over for trial 16, or I guess trial 18 is what that should say, then you move along to you move. You just start every time you make an error. You start back over at the prompt you were using at the start of that trial. So incorrect with visual. Next trial, we still tried to use visual again. So expressive skills prompt hierarchy. So these are for our verbal behaviors. So it looks very similar to our receptive skills prompt hierarchy, except we use a full verbal prompt, then a partial verbal prompt, then a visual prompt, and then we take out our prompting and hope that the child performs the skill independently. All right. Same thing, we got our types of expressive prompts in our prompt hierarchies. You got your most invasive to least invasive prompting. Same deal, except for verbal, full verbal, then to partial verbal, then to visual. And we're gonna, same deal, use to teach new verbal behaviors. So, and then least invasive to most invasive prompting, reverse that. You start with your visual, then your partial verbal, then your full verbal. These are going to be used to correct an error when learning a new verbal behavior. So let's look at some examples. So this is an example of our full verbal prompt.
What is he doing? Crawling. Good.
Okay, so what happened in the example? So the trainer shows a picture and asks, what is he doing? The trainer says the entire answer aloud and to prompt the correct response from the child. So they said, what is he doing? Crawling. And then the child says the correct answer, crawling. So this is the most invasive form of expressive prompting. Always start here when teaching a brand new verbal skill. So this is our partial verbal prompt.
What is he doing? What is he doing? Crawling. Good job.
Okay, so disregard what she said at first. Pretend like she didn't repeat herself. So they would say, "What is he doing?" That was how it should have gone. And she corrected herself for the second try. So basically, the trainer said, "What is he doing?" And then the child finished it out with the entire response, crawling. So the trainer says part of the answer aloud, just those first 2 letters, just the initial CR sound, and then the child says the whole response. So this is our second most invasive form of expressive prompting. And we always start here when teaching a brand new verbal, or no, we don't. We don't start there. This is where we go after 3 times in a row with our full verbal. Disregard that last part. So visual prompt. These are for our expressive examples. So you could give them a visual, like you could give them like if they can read, you can give them the written thing. You can give them a written, like the full like written answer, or just part of the written answer. So the part of our written answer, just use the first part of the text to produce the verbal response. The whole word crawl or crawling is used basically just using the whole word to produce a verbal response. So these are the least invasive forms of expressive prompting. The other visual prompts for expressive behaviors, you can use the I want visual to prompt a verbal response to the question, what do you want? And you can also use the I need a break visual to prompt a child to request a break when they are visibly frustrated. So if you see a kid who's upset, you can show them the I need a break card and hope that they request a break. Also, pictures can be used for non-readers. So if you need like an ASL visual that's of someone like doing the I want sign, or like the ASL visual for like hand like break with your hands. ASL is American Sign Language, but basically you can use picture visuals instead of like words. So let's take a look at the expressive skills prompt hierarchy in action. It's set up the same. You teach it the same way as you would with our receptive skills prompt hierarchy. You just use the prompts for expressive behaviors instead of receptive behaviors. So you give a verbal or visual direction. Then you immediately prompt using the most helpful prompt, which is instead of full physical is our full verbal. And then you fade the intensity of the helpfulness of the prompts one level at a time when the child performs the correct behavior for at least 3 opportunities in a row with the current level of prompting in place. So let's look at that in action. So trial 1, we're using a full verbal to get our correct response, and we get that 3 times in a row. So we fade to partial verbal. We're continuing to get the correct response with partial verbal in place for 3 trials in a row. So we fade to a visual prompt for our next 3 trials, and we're continuing to get the correct response for those 3 times in a row. So now we just take out all the prompting, and we're continuing to get our independent responding for at least 4 out of 5 opportunities. And now we're pretty confident that the child has learned the new behavior. So same deal, expressive prompt hierarchy. When you correct an error, you do 3 trials with full verbal to produce the correct response. Then partial verbal produces the correct response. Cool, move on. Oops, what happens when you make an error? All right, incorrect response with a partial verbal. You just use the full verbal prompt to get that correct response. And then you got to start over with getting your 3 in a row of them responding correctly with just the partial verbal prompt in place. And then you can fade that to the visual prompt. But oops, you made a incorrect response with the visual prompt. So then you got to fade in the partial verbal, and then if necessary, use that full verbal prompt to prompt the correct response. So after that, you got to start over again with your trying to get 3 trials in a row of the correct response using your visual prompt, and then you take out all prompting and hope that you get the correct response independent of prompting. But oops, you made a mistake. So you got to do the same thing. You got to not gestural. First, you use partial verbal, and then full verbal if necessary, or use visual, then full verbal, or use visual, then partial verbal, then full verbal if necessary. So that should say visual, and that should say no prompting in place. So no prompting after visual or verbal direction is given for 3 times in a row, or 4 out of 5 times in a row, then we can assume the child has learned the behavior. Okay, so after you've done that, the next thing you can talk about is linking multiple behaviors together with prompting. So some behaviors or tasks are complex and require learning many sub-skills in order to complete the entire task independently. So using prompt fading with the prompt hierarchy can be used with a procedure called chaining to chain each behavior together for a task. Chain each behavior together of a task to get. Oh no, sorry about that. That's a poorly worded sentence. Basically, use prompt fading and prompt hierarchy with the prompt hierarchy with the procedure. Sorry, you use fading of the prompt hierarchy with a procedure called chaining in conjunction with what's called a task analysis. So I'll explain more about that in my next presentation. So I'm going to explain what is a task analysis, I'm going to define a task analysis, and I'm going to show you how to use it with a chaining procedure to teach complex tasks with multiple sub-skills. All right, so that's all I have for you today. Thanks for sticking around if you're still here, and look out for that video about task analysis.